This is a brief Monday afternoon tropical weather update, and the main focus is on Major Hurricane Jova aiming for the Mexican coastline, and toward the second half of the video, we will also briefly touch on what is occurring in the Atlantic Basin. As of the 11 a.m. Pacific Time advisory from the National Hurricane Center, Hurricane Jova now has maximum sustained winds of 125 miles per hour, so it is still a Category 3, but it is continuing to strengthen, and it will more than likely become a Category 4 hurricane within the next 12 or so hours. This is the latest official forecast track, and they are showing a landfall near the vicinity of Manzanillo, Mexico, as we work our way into the second half of Tuesday and into the early morning hours of Wednesday. This is the latest look at the spaghetti model plots for Hurricane Jova, and we still have a couple models that take this system just to the west of Manzanillo and Puerto Vallarta. However, there are no indications that Jova will be making a due north turn anytime soon. In fact, it is still losing a little bit of longitude, so the official forecast track that is taking this system very close to Manzanillo is looking pretty good right now. However, there is still somewhat of a chance that it goes just to the west of Manzanillo, but that said, the greatest storm surge is going to be right under and just east of the center, so this is still looking like a fairly grim situation. And we still have quite a number of intensity models making Hurricane Jova a Category 4 shortly before landfall. Nevertheless, we still have one good bit of news, and that is the fact that the hurricane force winds continue to only extend 15 miles outward from the center, so many areas will not be experiencing hurricane force winds. However, it is still far too early to determine exactly where those maximum winds will hit the coastline, and that is the reason why we have hurricane warnings in effect for a rather large portion of the Mexican coast. This is including Manzanillo. Now, the best case scenario is that the eye makes landfall somewhere in a rural area so that less people are impacted. But even if that is the case, the storm surge will extend several miles, especially along to the east of the center. So even if the eye passes just to the west of Manzanillo, we may still have to deal with the risk of storm surge. This was the latest microwave satellite pass taken of Hurricane Jova just within the last 4 hours, and we can see that the inner core of the circulation is becoming better defined with every passing hour. In fact, the eye is now better defined than it ever has been in the storm's life cycle. And as we turn to the real-time visible and enhanced infrared imagery, we can see that the eye has become a little bit more obscured by convective cloud tops over the last few hours. However, this is still more than likely just a temporary fluctuation in the storm's intensity, as the upper level environment appears to be conducive for a steady strengthening all the way until landfall, and we can see that the storm is now beginning to make that turn more toward the north-northeast, going back to the visible really quickly, and so therefore Manzanillo and points just to the west need to be on the greatest lookout for this storm. You should be the most concerned right now because that is where the storm appears to be tracking. And furthermore, we still have a couple more tropical systems worth noting in the eastern Pacific. We are still dealing with Tropical Storm Irwin and a tropical disturbance to the south of the Gulf of Tehuantepec, and that is still being given a 50% chance of development within the next 2 days. However, unlike powerful Hurricane Jova, Tropical Storm Irwin is still just struggling to survive. It has maximum sustained winds of 40 miles per hour, making this just barely a tropical storm. And the good news is that the upper level environment does not appear to be overly conducive for this system, so it will more than likely just barely hang on as a classified tropical cyclone throughout the next 5 days, and the models simply show the system meandering around to the south of Mexico in the extended range without making a direct landfall, so we will simply just continue to monitor this system, but the greatest threat by far right now is Hurricane Jova. And before we move on, this is a quick look at Tropical Storm Irwin. It's looking rather pathetic on the latest satellite imagery, but it is hanging in there as a tropical system. And meanwhile, the tropical disturbance to the south of the Gulf of Tehuantepec still has a lot of disorganized convection. However, there are no signs of a well-defined surface circulation, and it looks more than likely that a broad area of low pressure will persist over much of the far eastern Pacific into Central America, and it will be interesting to see where the broad area of low pressure begins to move over open water, whether that be in the eastern Pacific or the western Caribbean within the next 5 to 10 days. We will touch more on that possibility in just a moment, but if we switch gears to the Atlantic Basin, this is what is left of the subtropical area of low pressure that made landfall along the east coast of Florida during the overnight hours. The low-level circulation is now just to the northwest of Ocala, Florida, and it's now beginning to spread into portions of southern Georgia. And as you can see, the greatest threat of heavy rainfall is now beginning to push on into the Carolinas. And over the last 6 to 12 hours, some of the biggest hoopla regarding this system has been why the Hurricane Center chose not to upgrade this system immediately prior to landfall. And I will more than likely have an extensive write-up explaining why they may have made the decision that they did. That is more than likely going to be posted on the 28storms.com front page within the next day or so. Of course, we are still primarily dealing with the major hurricane that is about to make landfall in Mexico. Really briefly, this is the 12Z ECMWF forecast for much of the Atlantic Basin, and there are really no signs of any activity over the first 4 to 5 days. However, as we go into Saturday afternoon, that is when we begin to see broad low pressure across much of the western Caribbean, extending westward across Central America and into the eastern Pacific. And as we go into day 6, we see two distinct areas of low pressure trying to form, one located just to the east of Belize, but we have a second system trying to develop in the eastern Pacific. Typically, it is somewhat difficult for two systems to develop so closely. Usually one system becomes the more dominant one, while the other fails to organize into a classified system. So this run is somewhat suspect, but more than anything, the ECMWF is telling us that we should be paying very close attention to anything that tries to develop over the open waters across the far eastern Pacific or the northwest Caribbean as we go into the period between days 5 and day 10, especially since this is the climatologically favored area for tropical development during the middle part of October. And in addition, we still have the favorable phase of the Madden-Julian oscillation that is working its way across the eastern Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. So even though we're getting into the latter part of the hurricane season, we still have quite a lot of activity out there. Please stay with 28storms.com and the Hurricane Tracker app all the way through the duration of hurricane season 2011.